Hello, this is Professor Otto von Feigenblatt, and my lecture is titled Traditional Education is Making a Comeback in the United States, Discursive Contestation in the Public Sphere. The passing of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 was a very important moment in American education. Not only did the act change educational priorities of thousands of schools, but it marked a watershed moment of the rise of primacy of progressive education in the United States. Thus, the passing of the law simply crystallized years of struggle between opposing camps in the field of education. A powerful international movement favoring progressive education in the Finnish and Swedish models had achieved considerable support in academia and political circles. It should be noted that support for No Child Left Behind was bipartisan, and thus the debate transcended political ideology. Educational success was reframed from an individual duty to a collective entitlement. Interestingly, American individualism survived in the form of a very peculiar interpretation of personalized education. Thus, education became not only an entitlement in terms of access, but also in terms of achievement. The philosophical idea, borrowed partly from the Nordic European countries, is that individualized education with fewer restrictions would lead to academic success. Therefore, the entire education system had to focus on the success of the individual student rather than the other way around, the student focusing on succeeding in the existing education system. Another important change was that the emphasis of resources and teaching methods would not be the top 85% of students, but rather the bottom 15%, explaining the No Child Left Behind name of the act. The repercussions of the passing of the No Child Left Behind Act on American education have been deep and widespread. Teachers have been encouraged to provide more flexibility to their students in the classroom, everything from flexible seating to transitioning from station to station to allow greater freedom of movement. The resubmission of assignments several times to provide formative opportunities for students to learn the material became the norm. Principals became obsessed with standardized tests and with the performance of the bottom 50%, with the result of a sharp increase in grade inflation and pressure on teachers to pass their students. The argument behind this shift to student-centered education is that the goal is for every student to succeed, and that in order to achieve the most effective approach is to adapt to the student's needs and learning style. Therefore, if a student prefers to move around the classroom while doing his or her work, then the teacher should allow it and focus on the essence of learning rather than on form, in this case, where to sit or not to sit. This is just one of many examples encompassed by this shift in paradigm which took place over many decades but reached its peak with the passing of the No Child Left Behind Act. Nevertheless, the paradigmatic shift did not lead to the expected results. It is true that the bottom 15% benefited from the change, with greater access to resources and a restructuring of the academic incentive structure to favor them. The overall results for the education system were dismal. Reading and math scores are lagging most other developed countries, and discipline is at an all-time low. Thus, the results of the No Child Left Behind paradigm has come under attack by a wide range of stakeholders, such as academics, parents, and teachers. The present lecture focuses on exploring some examples of public criticism of the No Child Left Behind orthodoxy in mainstream media with the purpose of identifying common themes. Education in the United States for most of the 20th century was divided into a wide range of philosophical camps. One camp can be labeled the traditional education camp, while the second camp can be labeled the progressive education camp. Even though the educational landscape was and is more complex than the two previously mentioned labels, they do help us understand the decades leading up to the passing of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. One of the main criticisms labeled as the so-called traditional education is that it is based on the model of the Industrial Revolution. Students are considered to be raw materials that need to be turned into a finished product to serve society. It is a collectivist model in which education is part of the socialization process. Therefore, education is meant to transform a child into a full member of society. A good metaphor to understand this process, as framed by the traditional education model, is that a child is like an unpolished gem and it needs to be polished and shaped to fit the use required by society. The polishing and shaping require removing the rough edges and require sharp tools and a long process in order to shape the gem to fit the design of the jewel. From a philosophical perspective, this approach prioritizes the need of the group over the interest of the individual. Moreover, students who do not conform to the needs of the group are considered to be deviant, and the system tends to filter them out. Traditional education leads to deviant students failing, which has real life consequences in terms of college admission and disciplinary measures. A confluence of factors, interest groups, and extreme individualism resulted in the achievement of a critical mass to pass the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 with bipartisan support. Part of the success behind this educational revolution was the emphasis on the individual and that the reforms had something to offer to a vast array of interest groups. For many parents, it was an opportunity to help their children finish high school. For others, it was a way to restructure the incentive structure of education at the K through 12 level to be more equitable from their point of view. The law focused on increasing testing of basic skills for students and greater accountability for schools and districts. At the core of the act was the idea that no child should be left behind, so the emphasis was on students who were not performing well. The act does not include any provisions for gifted students, students with intellectual quotients of 132 or above, while it included a vast array of provisions for students with disabilities. The Act requires standardized testing to track student achievement, with the result of a greater emphasis at the national level on preparing students for exams. Mounting criticism resulted in Congress removing the national aspects of the Act in 2015. Nevertheless, the emphasis on the bottom 15% remains, because the most important impact of the Act was the process of reframing the goal of K through 12 education in the United States. While the emphasis of American education before the Act was to prepare most of the student population to enter the workforce by socializing them into the norms and mores of an industrial society, the new goals were redefined as helping the individual growth to promote educational equity. If we compare internationally, then we can say that it is important to note that many of the ideas incorporated by the movement or movements leading up to the passing of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 were borrowed from the experiences of other countries. In particular, the educational practices of Nordic countries such as Sweden and Finland were the prime examples. It is necessary to provide some socio-political, economic, and cultural contextual background to understand how those practices developed and how they were translated for the American context. Sweden, Norway, and Finland became the gold standard for education systems in and during the last decades of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st. Reading scores were high for most students, and they consistently excelled in international benchmarks such as the PISA scores. Moreover, the teaching style used in Nordic classrooms provided great freedom for individual expression and an emphasis on learning by doing. Small classroom sizes also allowed the teacher to help those students who struggle with the material and to adapt assessments to the strengths of each pupil. Flexible seating, inverted classrooms, experiential learning inter alia add up to a smorgasbord of progressive education techniques used by those countries. Thus, the example of those Nordic countries was used by progressives to justify the adoption of their teaching techniques and to support their teaching philosophy. However, there are several factors that were not taken into consideration when comparing the United States and the previously mentioned Nordic countries. The United States is a very diverse nation with a capitalist system, while the Nordic countries are very homogeneous and are social democracies. Those differences are very important because a teacher at a school in Finland or Sweden can expect her students to be homogeneous, culturally, and in terms of socioeconomic status. Nordic countries have extensive economic and social safety nets, which guarantee that all households enjoy a certain minimum quality of life. School teachers in those countries can focus on teaching rather than on ancillary services such as compensating for unequal home conditions for the children. One good indicator of the social differences between the United States and the Nordic countries is that the United States ranks among the lowest third of developed countries in terms of safety, while Finland ranks among the highest. Classroom management is much easier when the students are homogeneous and when the households of the children are relatively stable in terms of socioeconomic issues. On the other hand, the United States has a very diverse, very different socioeconomic system. American capitalism is based on the idea that the free market should be the main factor in guiding the economy. Moreover, taxes in the United States are much lower than those in the Nordic countries. Thus, the idea of a high degree of economic redistribution through high taxation is inimical to the American system. The result of the American system is a meritocracy, which creates a high degree of polarization in terms of socioeconomic status and class. Therefore, the gap between households in terms of educational level and income is much wider in the United States than in the Nordic countries. In addition to the socioeconomic diversity of the United States, there is a much higher cultural and ethnic diversity in comparison to the Nordic countries. The correlation between the progressive teaching techniques and teaching philosophy favored in the Nordic countries and high test scores in standardized examinations cannot be attributed to the teaching techniques themselves, but rather to the demographic characteristics of the countries in question. The argument made by many proponents of the No Child Left Behind coalition that the techniques used in the Nordic countries would automatically improve academic achievement in the United States is incorrect. A counterexample is the case of Singapore, South Korea, and the People's Republic of China. The previously mentioned countries are all located in Asia, and they favor a traditional classical education in the Confucian model. The three countries are collectivist from a cultural perspective and are known for their emphasis on uniformity and discipline. The PISA scores of the previously mentioned countries rival and have recently surpassed those of the Nordic countries. Therefore, it is a fallacy to claim that the only way to achieve high scores in reading and mathematics is to adopt the progressive educational practices of the Nordic countries. Moreover, the recent rise to the top of the PISA charts of many Asian countries cannot be explained by the use of innovative student-centered teaching techniques because those countries uphold a very traditional teacher-centric model. It would also be problematic to claim that the academic success of China, Singapore, and South Korea are solely based on the classical education model. Nevertheless, they show that the classical education model can also deliver excellent results in the 21st century. It should be noted that a Confucian legacy permeates every aspect of their societies. Now let's talk about domestic issues here in the United States. At the national level in the United States of America, several domestic crises in education have prompted a re-examination of a heretofore dominant student-centered progressive model of education. The core crisis is evidenced by the low scores in standardized exams, and it is paralleled by a severe national shortage of qualified teachers. Moreover, ancillary crises include a rise in violent incidents in public schools and a sharp drop in overall discipline in several regions of the country. There is a consensus over certain facts related to the previously mentioned crisis. Standardized testing, and in particular PISA scores, dealing with reading and mathematics have dropped over the last few years and lag behind other industrialized countries. The Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, has voiced concern about the increasingly severe shortage of teachers, and the numbers show that the shortage is not improving. Just in the state of Florida, there are over 5,000 open positions for teachers. The rise in violent incidents in schools is also amply documented by police reports and by the reports released by the Department of Education and by individual school districts. Nevertheless, there is disagreement. Disagreement exists regarding the root causes of the crisis in education. Progressive educators and academics focus on external causes such as economic polarization and traditional social ills such as racial discrimination, lack of access to public services, and the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thus, according to progressive academics, the drop in scores and the shortage simply reflects wider social forces such as a tight labor market due to the low national unemployment rates, stagnating salaries in the public sector, and socioeconomic polarization leading to mental health issues. While there is no doubt that those external factors play an important role in shaping education, there seems to be a contradiction in the argument of progressives in terms of originally positing student-centered models as the solution to the social problems mentioned in the No Child Left Behind Act, and now attributing the lack of progress on those same social ills. Thus, there is a circular logic to the argument. On the other hand, scholars favoring classical and traditional education point to the lack of discipline and extreme individualism fostered by a progressive student-centered education as the cause for the drop in standardized scores and the widespread discipline problems throughout the United States. The changes are multi-causal, and there is a plethora of intervening variables, making it very difficult to empirically assess the validity of the claims of the competing camps. Nevertheless, an interesting phenomenon is the discursive contestation over the philosophical underpinnings of both camps. For many decades, progressive education has held a stranglehold over the public sphere in terms of debates over education. However, it seems that cracks are starting to show in this hegemonic control, partly because of the clear disconnect between the improvements promised and the actual results. Now let's talk a little bit about the theoretical framework that we can use to understand this issue. One of the central challenges in studying debates in the field of education is the ambiguity of many of the concepts used by opposing camps. Educational discourse is both pervasive and ill-defined. Many terms used in education are part of daily parlance, and thus there is great confusion between the academic meaning of terms and their meaning in colloquial language. This is particularly the case for terms with political underpinnings, such as progressive and traditional. Those two labels mark the contested border between the two main philosophical camps in education. Nevertheless, there is considerable disagreement about the meaning of both terms, and the border shifts in terms depending on the historical period and specific issues in discussion. Even though there are many definitions of both philosophical camps, namely progressive and traditional education, for the present lecture, we will focus the definition provided by Scott Davis. Davis posits that the various strands of progressivism have been historically united, if tenuously, by their antagonism to traditional forms of schooling, and that a counterframe of dated, inefficient, and inhumane traditional schools has historically offered progressives a common identity. Other important elements mentioned by Davis include a core consisting of a belief in active, individualized, child-centered education that is aimed at the whole child, as well as attachment of images of progress. Another important aspect of progressive education is an emphasis on equity and on equality. The centrality of this issue has risen and waned from decade to decade, but remains important in the ethos of the philosophical movement. Traditional education is an equally ill-defined term. There are many strands of traditional education linked to political conservatism. Even though it is very difficult to generalize the core tenets of traditional education, partly because it is also defined as a counterpoint to progressive education, there are a few central beliefs that can be mentioned. A few of them can be mentioned. One strand of traditional education focuses on the inclusion of moral and ethical education as part of the curriculum. Moral and ethical education can be linked to one or another religious tradition, but this is not always the case. Another important aspect of traditional education is that it tends to be collectivist in the sense that it emphasizes respect for social rules and order. In many cases, patriotism and respect for institutions is also emphasized. This leads to prioritizing social norms over the ones of the individual. Traditional education tends to view its role as shaping law-abiding citizens. In other words, the individual is supposed to adapt to the requirements of society in a long process of socialization. Therefore, traditional education fits very well with anthropological and sociological views of socialization and acculturation processes. Moreover, traditional education accepts some of the same assumptions made by most theories of socialization and acculturation, such as that there are certain social mores which can be considered to be the basic tenets of a social group. There is also the implied assumption that social cohesion and agreement on a few central core social principles are necessary for society to function. An important point that should be mentioned is that conservatism and progressivism in political discourse do not always parallel the meaning of traditional and progressive education. Even though the moral and ethical aspects of conservatism align with some strands of traditional education, the emphasis of conservatism changes with time. The same is true in the case of traditional education. Contemporary American conservatism is very individualist in certain aspects, while traditional education includes important aspects of collectivism. Moreover, from an economic perspective, American conservatism supports a liberal approach to economics. Thus, the two labels are not perfectly concomitant. The same is true in terms of progressive politics and progressive education. There are several strands of progressive political thought, with some favoring individual choice while others favoring collective needs. So now let's talk about discursive contestation in the public sphere. The COVID pandemic provided a rare loosening in the stranglehold of progressive educational discourse on the public sphere. Part of the reason for this loosening is that the education system was under severe stress nationwide due to the shutdowns and as a result of the weaknesses exposed by the transition to virtual education. Christopher Perry and Anika Prater provide a very powerful explanation in their National Review article about the resurgence of classical education. One of the examples of practices and statements made by progressive school officials that expose the emptiness of some of the policies espoused by progressive education is how Governor Kate Brown of Oregon, who suspended both reading and math graduation requirements in Oregon, arguing that this would help Black, Latino, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander, and students of color. Thus, the solution was removing the bar and to basically hand out credentials. The paternalism and condescension in the policy struck a raw nerve among educators working with minority students who immediately realized that the everyone gets a participation medal approach does not work in this case. Certifying education is not the same thing as actually educating. Perry and Prater forcefully argue that minorities need to gain actual skills, not for the system to hand them high school diplomas without gaining the actual skills and knowledge. Complex attempts to translate the inverted classroom to an online environment during a time of crisis simply resulted in a loss of learning. Many educators and parents decided to return to a classical educational approach focused on grade works, reading, and mathematics. In other words, to go back to the basics of learning, focus on reading, writing, and mathematics. According to Perry and Prater, parents of students of color were focused on helping their children learn basic skills. The pandemic showed the importance of the basics of education and the desire to attain useful skills. On the other hand, the pandemic also unveiled some of the empty promises of progressive education, such as the fallacy of equating certifying achievement with the actual achievement of skills and competencies. In addition to minority parents and educators who have challenged many of the dogmas of progressive education, Christians and conservatives have seized the rare opening of the public sphere to challenge progressive education in higher education. Sean Salai presents a changing landscape in public opinion in a recent special report published by the Washington Times. Salai quotes Rachel Fulton Brown from the University of Chicago as positing that the goal is to make academia medieval again. The comment was made with respect to a return to the study of the classics, and in particular to the emphasis of preserving the original uncensored versions of great works of literature and art. Thus, medieval in this case refers to the free discussion of ideas at the university level, and an emphasis on broad and holistic learning rather than specialized and vocational training. It is important to note that higher education presents a contradictory picture in terms of the ideological landscape of teaching. On one hand, most professors tend to be aligned with important tenets of progressive education, such as a rhetorical preference for individualized education and for increased diversity in the classroom. Nevertheless, the common teaching technique at the college level continues to be the traditional lecture, and there is a parallel yearning for freedom of speech and academic freedom, which implies the frank discussion of uncensored texts. Moreover, there is a certain paternalism in the ethos of higher education because of the composition of the faculty, which represents the intellectual aristocracy, basically. Faculty members have achieved the highest level of academic attainment and thus have earned the right to teach at the college and university levels. Thus, Shen Salai is reporting on a reaction by certain members of academia against a limitation of their academic freedom, which in this case involves the freedom to teach the great works of Western civilization. Another important trend mentioned by Salai is the rejection of the utilitarian emphasis of certain strands of progressive education, which aim to conflate education with vocational training. A return to Humboldt's concept of Bildung, a more holistic education focused on individual growth, is favored by many Christian conservatives and academics. One particular event cracked the stranglehold of progressive education over the public sphere, the result of the 2022 National Assessment of Educational Progress, which showed considerable drops in reading and math in almost the entire United States. Even though it was expected that there would be learning losses during the pandemic, the surprising part of the report was the uneven drop in scores. American Catholic School fared very well, earning the highest scores in the NAEP tests. The difference was two grade levels for 8th grade reading between National Public School average and Catholic school students. Even if race is disaggregated, black students and Hispanic students gain points while the same demographic groups drop in terms of their scores in public schools. Moreover, Porter notes that many Catholic schools serve needed urban students and thus the economic privilege argument does not hold. Thus, Catholic schools manage to achieve more with less funding. The scores are not debatable. However, the reason for the gap between Catholic schools and national public schools is always subject to interpretation. From an emic perspective, as reported by Porter, Catholic schools favor a conservative, family focused education with a high degree of participation from parents. Catholic education is infused with moral and ethical teachings, and there is no doubt about the centrality of socialization in the education process. Thus, the individual is taught that certain tenets must be followed and that he or she must adapt to the norms of society. In essence, the basic principles of traditional education. The undeniable results of the national exams were reported by the media, and logical gymnastics were attempted by progressive pundits to attempt to avoid engaging in the basic argument of traditional education. Nevertheless, parents and the silent majority took note, as reflected by an almost immediate increase in enrollment in Catholic schools. The Associated Press reported about the increased enrollments and thus further opened the public discussion over the merits of traditional education. Another very interesting opening in the public sphere related to the struggle between proponents of a traditional and progressive education is the debate over the attempted censorship of Roald Dahl's books. As one of the most widely known authors of children's books, his stories are read in schools all over the world. Progressive groups have put pressure on publishing houses to censor and edit classic books. The ideas in many of those books, such as Matilda, challenge many of the tenets of progressive education and favor strong families and morals. One of the publishing houses that succumbed to the pressure was Puffin, the publisher of all of Dahl's books. A very interesting article published by the Guardian newspaper in the UK, known as a progressive newspaper, published a scathing critique of the attempted censorship. Among the critics of the proposed censorship, Booker Prize laureate Salman Rushdie is quoted as expressing anger due to some of the passages dealing with mental health, gender, and weight were edited or entirely rewritten. Another prominent critic of the censorship is Laura Hackett, deputy literary editor of London's Sunday Times newspaper, who is quoted as saying, "The editors at Puffin should be ashamed of the botched surgery they've carried out on some of the finest children's literature in Britain," and asserted that as for me, I'll be carefully stowing away my old original copies of Dahl stories so that one day my children can enjoy them in their full, nasty, colorful glory. The strong reactions are not surprising, but the frankness and openness of the challenge in the public sphere is refreshingly new. Challenging the censorship of books publicly exposes one to attacks by proponents of progressive education and can have very serious consequences for a person's career prospects. Nevertheless, the willingness of heavyweights such as Rushdie to challenge the censorship openly and with extreme frankness shows that the grip of progressive over the public sphere is weakening. So now we'll provide a few tentative conclusions. The present exploratory lecture over public discourse dealing with the progressive traditional divide in education reveals a few important characteristics of the debate over progressive and traditional education. One of the obvious conclusions is that the debate is complex due to its ambiguity and the permeability of the sides. Thus, higher education academics may support some ideas espoused by progressives while supporting others linked to traditional education. The concept of academic freedom is one such meeting point. Several strands of contemporary progressive education favor adapting the text to the students by selecting texts targeted to particular demographics and censoring great works to tailor them to contemporary tastes. However, many academics reject this paternalism and are averse to any form of censorship, putting them in the same camp as traditional educators on this issue. The reaction against the attempted removal of the original versions of the books of Roald Dahl provides clear evidence of the increasingly energetic debate over the censorship of books favored by many progressive educators. Another important conclusion is that there has been a loosening in the grip of progressive education over the public sphere, resulting in more open criticism of some of the central tenets of the ideology. This has resulted in opponents of some of the tenets of progressive education coming forward to engage in constructive debate in the public interest. One of the likely reasons for this opening in the public sphere is the appalling performance of the United States in the PISA exams and the sharp drop in reading and math scores at the national level. The success of Catholic schools in relation to public schools further strengthened the need to have a frank and open discussion over the merits of certain policies espoused by progressive education, such as an obsession with political correctness and an emphasis on equity rather than on equality of opportunities. So now we'll provide a few recommendations. It is necessary to conduct more research about leadership of schools favoring traditional education. The outstanding results of Catholic schools in national reading and math tests show that it is possible to learn reading and writing without inverting the classroom and reading the unedited versions of the great works of Western civilization. It also shows that students can learn how to write even if they must sit in straight rows of desks rather than on beanbags. Moreover, it shows that integrating values and morals as part of the hidden curriculum with the support of parents and the wider community does not preclude the development of the individual, but rather supports and sustains it. Finally, more research on the importance of the centrality of the teacher in the process of learning is warranted. After all, one of the principal disagreements between the two camps is the centrality of the teacher in education. Thus, the rise of countries following a traditional model of education in the PISA rankings and the relative success of religious schools in the United States point to a need for further debate and training in traditional methods of education. At the very least, it is necessary to reopen the debate over the effectiveness of many techniques espoused by progressive educators. Thank you for your attention.